Our journeys along the pathways of the Somme Battlefields not only take us to the places where the fighting reached its peak, but to those villages, those quiet lanes and woods behind the lines. In this episode, we walk the village of Mailly-Maillet behind the Somme front of 1916. Welcome back to the Old Front Line podcast in the start of what is season 8, and we're now moving rapidly towards our 5th anniversary. Yep, that's right, our 5th anniversary. Can it really be 5 years since I recorded that very first episode on Posiers? It's truly amazing. What began in a very difficult time for all of us when we were often isolated and alone, and certainly in respect to the battlefields of the Great War, we all felt a very, very long way from them. It was a way of perhaps of weaving us all closer to that place, to that landscape of the First World War. And I had no idea that I would still be doing it 5 years later, and certainly no idea that we'd have achieved so much along the way. I get a huge amount of pleasure through doing this podcast. It's truly amazing, really, that we not only have the opportunity to discuss the Great War and share our fascination of the Great War. It's a way in which I've continue to learn so much, and through interacting with so many of you, I've been truly humbled, really, by so many of your comments and the way you've expressed what the Great War means to you. And as we move into that 5th anniversary period this March, we're also approaching 250 episodes of the Old Front Line, which I think will probably reach sometime in the autumn. And incredibly, back in December, I checked the podcast statistics the other day. We went past 1.5 million downloads since the podcast started. Now, for an independent podcast, that is quite incredible, and it's a testimony to all of you, the way you listen and the way you support. And as always, I can't thank you enough for just listening. And it's never just listening. Listening is such an important way to support what the podcast does and what it's all about, and hopefully a way for us to achieve the aim which I think we're all looking to move towards, which is greater awareness and understanding of the First World War, and ensuring that the memory of that conflict and all of those who were a part of it will never be lost in the pages of history. And I can't thank you enough for all of you who get in touch, and all of you who directly support the podcast on platforms like Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. All of that helps immensely in moving this podcast forward with new equipment, trips to the battlefields, and all kinds of things. And I really love the community that we've built. We're the old frontliners, we're the old contemptibles. I don't know what we call ourselves, but I'm so glad that we have this community of like-minded individuals that are so engaged with the subject. So in this season, season 8, we will continue with battlefield walks, and we're starting with one in this very first episode, plus episodes on various aspects of Great War history, from things like trench raids through to flamethrowers, and much more besides. And the Q&A episodes that we started in the previous season have proved so popular, they'll obviously continue too. And that enables us to talk about a lot of diverse aspects of the First World War as well. But this is the start of a new season, a new chapter in the Old Front Line, and we begin quite appropriately with a battlefield walk. And what better place than those fields and lanes of the Somme? So let's strap on our virtual boots, head off to Picardy with our virtual pack, and see where our Great War journey takes us. For this battlefield walk, We're not on the ground where the fighting was at its fiercest. We're behind the lines on the Somme. And as I've mentioned many times on this podcast, I can't emphasise enough the importance of not just visiting the place where the fighting actually took place, where the trenches were, where the bayonet charges were, where the flamethrower attacks were, where the mines went off. Not just those locations. Those are, in many respects, the obvious and understandable places to venture to when you visit the battlefields, the landscape of the First World War. But that landscape is not just about those fields of death, those fields of conflict. The wider soldiers' experience of the First World War didn't just put them in the front line. It took them away from the trenches, marching down the dusty lanes of northern France and Flanders, staying in villages, being billeted in barns behind the lines, and spending a lot of time away from that main battlefield area. And what we find in areas that are behind the lines, where there were bombardments, there was damage from shell fire, from aerial bombardments, we do find a lot more original buildings that act as kind of time capsules of the First World War in all kinds of different ways. And it's those kind of themes and those kind of places that we're going to visit in this virtual walk around the key village of Mailly-Maillet, as the troops almost certainly called it during the Great War. And we're starting our walk, this walk, which is based on one of the walks in my book, Walking the Somme, west of the village of Mailly-Maillet at Maywood Cemetery. Now, to get here, we've had to come off the main road and take a grass track that goes along the old chateau walls, many of which are original, and you can see battle damage in some of the brickwork as you walk along there. Then it does a sharp right angle, right turn, and takes you down to the cemetery itself. The cemetery is tucked away close to an area that was marked on British maps and referred to in veterans' accounts and soldiers' memoirs as the Mailly Woods, the May Woods. And this is, as you can see even today, a wooded area. You can hear woodpeckers amongst those trees in the spring, summer and autumn. The skylarks, of course, are in the big open fields close to where the cemetery is located. But in the woods and the glades, I kind of feel there's a timelessness to those places that connects us to these typical behind-the-lines locations that villages like Mailly-Maillet are. And the woods were used as a big billeting area for British troops. There were tents there, and there were huts later on too. And tens of thousands of men came through these woods, came through these camps that were here during that period of the Great War, when the British first arrived on the Somme in the summer of 1915 through to the Great Battle of 1916, and then later when the fighting returned to this sector in the spring of 1918, when the Germans tried to break through on this part of northern France, indeed on many parts of northern France at that time. So it's a place that connects us not just to the typical Somme year of 1916, but a wider period and lots of different aspects of soldiers' experience. And before we get to the Mailly-Wood Cemetery, where we're standing at the gates of that now with its bronze gate in front of us and the two sections of wall with the Portland stone entrances with the name of the cemetery engraved, carved into it. Before we get to that, we're going to have an extract from a book. And we talk about books all the time on this podcast, and I know that I cost many of you a lot of money in the books that you then go and seek out, but I can't come to a place like this and not mention Graham Greenwell's An Infant in Arms. Now, this is a book that I bought very early on in my kind of journey through the First World War, when you could go to the bookshops, the old second-hand bookshops of southern England, Sussex, where I was living then, and find these rarities or fine volumes that would take you on journeys across to those battlefields and help you uncover new truths about the experience of the First World War. And Graham Greenwell was an officer in the 1st 4th Battalion of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry in the 48th South Midland Division. And the book is based on his diaries and some of his letters and covers quite a wide period from when he arrived in France in 1915 through the Great Battle of the Somme in 1916 to their actions on the Hindenburg Line and up in Passchendaele, Ypres in 1917. And then they moved off to Italy for the final phase of the war, and there's quite a lot about his experiences there. It's a well-observed account with a lot of detail, and Graham Greenwell, I think, it is certainly up there when it comes to the memoirs of the First World War. It's a book that has been reprinted. I don't think it's particularly difficult or expensive to get hold of, but certainly, in my view, it's a book that you should have on your shelves. And this is his account of arriving at Mailly-Maillet in the early phase of the Battle of the Somme in July of 1916. We were moved yesterday to our allotted position, a large field behind Mailly-Maillet. I rode over with the battalion and was never so thankful for a horse. The march was very hot and dusty, but the various pieces of news received en route of the capture of villages and of different positions bucked the men up tremendously. It was a wonderful sight to watch the guns and ammunition limbers galloping up into action. We met motor ambulances bringing back the wounded, and the excitement became intense when some Hun prisoners passed us. Having reached our field, we made our preparations to move into the inferno at any moment. Meanwhile, we listened to the din and watched the heavy guns firing. Night came and we dossed down with a waterproof sheet and a mackintosh. It was miserably cold, and the noise became worse than ever. However, I warmed myself up with a tot of rum and got a little sleep. Now that took place in the woods, which we can see from where we're standing now, and once more kind of brings home the importance of having the literature of the Great War, the accounts of the Great War, and layering them in to the landscape of that Western Front, of those battlefields of that war when we visit them today. But we've come to a cemetery, and we're going to see several burial grounds on this route to further understand what happened in and around the village of Mailly-Maillet during this period of the Great War. And this burial ground here at Mailly Wood was started in the approach to the Battle of the Somme in June 1916. Previous burials had been at the communal cemetery, the civilian cemetery, on the far side of the village, which we will see later on in this walk. That was quite a common approach to bury the dead, either where there was an existing cemetery used by one of our allies, in this case the French, and there was French burials there, and we then buried our soldiers alongside them, or to use what was already consecrated ground to bury the dead there until that cemetery became kind of overloaded with burials and a proper cemetery needed to be constructed elsewhere. And that's what led to the creation of this cemetery on the far side of the village, kind of safe side of the village, where they were away from direct observation of the Germans, in the frontline positions at places like Serre and the Redan Ridge and close to Beaumont-Hamel, and they could bury the dead without risking their own troops being killed in the process. But there was a sad incident that led to the original burials. I suspect the cemetery was being prepared in preparation for the attack on the first day of the Somme, but on the 25th of June 1916, the first burials here were 13 men from the 2nd Battalion Seaforth Highlanders, who were laid to rest here following a long-range bombardment of their bivouacs in the wooded area, causing more than 50 casualties, most of them just from one shell. And what happened was that two 5.9-inch shells, Jack Johnsons, as the British soldiers often called them, dropped close to where their tented area was, and the men reacted to that very quickly and moved away in the opposite direction, but straight into the path of the next shell. So that third shell caught them in the open, and that's what caused most of the casualties. And the majority of the men who were killed and wounded were battalion scouts. So they were part of the scouts and snipers section of the 2nd Seaforths, men who would operate in the forward part of the battlefield to ascertain where the enemy was, observe the enemy, gather intelligence information about them, and then the snipers within the scouts and snipers section would carry out sniper activity against the enemy as well. But their principal task was not to shoot at the enemy, that could be required of them, but it was to observe and gain far more knowledge through that observation when in the front line positions. So they would have been, in terms of the commander of that battalion, they would have been some of his most useful men in terms of operating on a battlefield, and to lose so many of them in one go would have been quite a critical blow for the 2nd Seaforths. Burials then continued once the Battle of the Somme began, and the fighting moved in and around the village of Mailly-Maillet, from the attacks at Serre, from the fighting on the Redan Ridge, and the attempted advances towards Beaumont-Hamel. And soldiers killed in those sectors were brought back here for burial, and in the village itself was a number of Royal Army Medical Corps locations, ADSs, advanced dressing stations, where the wounded were brought to, and when soldiers died there, they were then brought here for burial. But when we look at the casualties that are in here, it is dominated not so much by Serre, because that had its own casualty evacuation route, which took the wounded from that battlefield to other villages, other destinations slightly away from here. But if we look at the units, if we look at the orders of battle, we see that the connection between the casualties that are in here, particularly from July 1916, relate to the attacks on the Redan and Hawthorne ridges, that kind of classic 1st of July battlefield from the beginning of the Great Somme Offensive. Fighting then returned to this area in March and April of 1918. On the 21st of March, the Germans broke through in the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, pushed the British Army back tens of miles over the next few days, back onto the old Somme battlefields, and a number of units were brought down to try and stem the tide of the German advance in this area, most notably the 12th Eastern Division, who were a Kitchener's Army division that had been formed in 1914 and by 1918 had very few of its originals still left in it, but it still had a very good reputation as a fighting division. It was brought down and it served in this area around Mailly-Maillet, keeping the Germans back, and alongside it were the New Zealand Division, and to the north of them the 4th Australian Division up around Hebuterne. And that line of units in March 1918 and on into April were very effective in stopping the Germans in this sector, playing a vital role in that phase of the battle. So the cemetery reflects all of this in those different time frames and the kinds of units that went through here. And post-war, a number of small cemeteries that had existed within Mailly-Maillet village itself were closed and then moved in here when graves were concentrated. So there's now 703 burials in Mailly Wood Cemetery, of which 615 are British, 25 New Zealand, and 3 South African. 60 of these are unidentified. In the November 1916 plots, there's quite a lot of men who were killed in the Battle of the Yonne on the 13th of November 1916, including a lot of casualties from the 51st Highland Division, who went over the top from the trenches that are now in what is known as the Newfoundland Part, where the Newfoundland Regiment went over the top on the 1st of July. On the 13th of November, the Jocks from the 51st Highland Division attacked there, and that's where their divisional memorial is located. And considering the Seaforths were the ones that essentially started this cemetery, it gives the cemetery a kind of a Scottish feel, I think. When you come here, you can see a lot of Scottish regimental cap badges reflecting the losses from those units. One of the graves that when I was walking the Somme all those years ago that I came across, I did some research on, because there's quite a good unit history about the unit that he was in, and that's the grave of Captain Herbert Geoffrey Lush Wilson. He was a regular officer in Y Battery Raw Horse Artillery, and he'd served at Gallipoli and then on the Somme with the 29th Division, and they published a separate artillery history of the units in the 29th Division that details quite a lot about the men and the units and the activities of those artillery units in the Great War. And from that, and doing a bit of research on him, we discover that he was killed by German counter-battery fire when they'd ascertained where their artillery units were located. Y Battery RHA, they had 13-pounder field guns, so they were light field guns, and they were often used to fire shrapnel bombardments onto the German positions. And those gun battery sites which had the 13-pounders in were seen by the Germans, probably from an observation balloon, and then targeted, and Captain Lush Wilson was one of the casualties, being killed there on the 21st of July 1916, aged 33. He was a talented horseman before the war, the son of a judge, Sir Herbert Lush Wilson KC, and he won prizes for fencing before the Great War as well. By the time of his death, he'd been awarded the Légion d'honneur by France and had quite the experience both at Gallipoli, in Cape Helles and Suvla Bay, and also on the Western Front. But he was a man who probably, by the end of the war, if he'd survived, would have been quite a senior gunner officer, but his war was cut short here on the Somme. And the idea that gunners like him were in some kind of safe job, the infantry often called them 1,000-mile snipers because they inferred they were so far from the front. But when we come to cemeteries like this, we see gunners' graves and we see the casualties that they suffered. Also close by is a much-visited grave in here, and that is Sergeant Harold John Colley, VCMM, of the 10th Lancashire Fusiliers. He died of wounds received at Martinpuy, which is quite some way from here, on the 25th of August 1918. He'd been awarded the military medal for bravery in a trench raid at Beaumont-Hamel in June of 1918, when the front lines had re-established in that area and they were going out to find information as to where the German positions were and who was there, and he got the MM for that action. And his VC was for a posthumous attack on the German positions during the advance from Courcelette to Martinpuy, and he was hit in that fighting there. They advanced quite some distance over the Ancre Heights, down and around the village of Courcelette, over those places where the Canadians had fought in 1916, and then across the Albert-Bapaume road into the village of Martinpuy. And during that fighting, he was mortally wounded, being brought back to a dressing station at Mailly-Maillet, and he died of his wounds there, which is how his grave came to be here. For a long time, when I first wrote Walking the Somme, I thought his grave had been moved from Martinpuy, but of course now when we go on to the Commission's website, we can see all the concentration and burial reports, and we can discover more. That's how this knowledge of the First World War evolves all the time, and from those records we can see that he was originally buried here, so he must have been brought back for treatment in one of the dressing stations, and this village must have been on the route of evacuation of casualties from that advance in the final Battle of the Somme in August of 1918. So we'll bid our farewell to the lads buried here and return down that grass path towards the chateau walls and do a dogleg turn that takes us back to the road. If we continue to our left, that would take us further behind the lines to a lot of villages that are very much associated with the medical evacuation of British and Commonwealth soldiers from the frontline battlefields during that Battle of the Somme period in 1916, where there are many more cemeteries containing the dead of those who died of their wounds. Another visit for another day. We're going to turn right and head towards the very heart of Mailly-Maillet village now. And one of the things we see as we begin to walk along this road and look at the buildings around us, yes, there are some newer buildings here, but many of these buildings were here at the time of the First World War. The walls of the chateau, as we've said, do bear some battle damage, but there is quite a large building on the left-hand side set back from the road, a very pretty, almost chateau-like building that was used by the New Zealanders in 1918, and there are some photographs and drawings of the building in use by the New Zealand division here during that period. And that building is absolutely peppered with impact marks from shells, probably going right back to the very beginning of military operations around May when the French were here in 1914-15, through to the British experience, and then the later 1918 experience when the 12th Eastern and New Zealand Division were here. And this became very much part of the New Zealand Division echelon as they held the front line beyond May across to the ridge near to the village of Auchanvillers, or Ocean Villas as the troops called it. But as we come into the main street of the village, the Grand Rue if you like, the High Street as we'd call it, we come to a major road junction where the road goes off to the right, where we can see in the distance Mailly-Maillet Church and the trees of the park close to the other side of the Chateau of May. And on the corner here is a building that became known as the White House, for obvious reasons when you look at it, because it is a typical Picardy building built out of white chalk stone. And it's a very large structure that sat on the corner here. It was used by a number of different units. The Royal Engineers had it, the Royal Sussex had it when they were here, South Downs battalions when they occupied the village in the summer of 1916, and many, many others besides. And back in the day, back in the 90s, a British family took over this house, and it was run for a little while as a bed and breakfast. And there was a little museum, kind of a billet out the back where you could stay in a museum with Great War artefacts in there. It's no longer a B&B. It's gone back to a French residence now. But it's an important building, and Edmund Blunden, who was here with the Royal Sussex, mentions it in his book Undertones of War. So that's our kind of second book connected to this area that we're going to mention in this podcast. Undertones of War, classic First World War memoir, a young officer's view of life as a platoon commander on the Western Front, and seeing some of the great battles from the South Downs attack at Richebourg through to the fighting on the Somme, and then he spends more than a year at Ypres from 1916 through to 1917 before he's then pulled out of the battalion just before the March offensive, which probably saves Blunden's life, and he leaves the men behind. It's a very affectionate look at the men that he served with. He mentions many, many names of ordinary soldiers that he had great admiration for in the book. It's a well-written book. He was a professional writer, poet, and the language in it reflects that, of course. But what he has left us is this kind of snapshot of different places, which again, we can link that to the landscape as it is today and kind of layer up that landscape with these accounts. And what I've got for you is Blunden's account of where we're standing now from Undertones of War. But I recall the singular phantasmal appearance of another wealthy house in Mailly. The engineers used it as a headquarters. Its large drawing room was finished in delicate Arcadian style, the suites and the curtains being of a silvery grey silk, the piano of a light volatile design and clear tinge answering it. The tall windows were blocked with sandbags, thoughtfully painted white, as they too would harmonise. Perhaps the hues of dust and dimness helped them somewhat in that impossibility. The room was unreal and supernatural, nor did I feel easy about the spirit's attitude towards my drinking my whisky by that incredible piano. Surely strange music would begin in tones of protest and prophecy. How long, I wonder, was it before the spell was snapped and the day gaped impudently through the imperishable shell holes on those exercised haunters? So that very eloquent description of a shell-damaged, boarded-up, sandbagged house, but still with its former occupants' artefacts inside, the piano standing mute, and the vestiges of an old world surrounding Blunden as he drank his whisky, is typical of Undertones of War. And when we look at buildings like this, there is so much history. And this is, I think, again, one of the importance of walking the ground behind the lines. On the battlefield, we have to imagine so much. The trenches have gone, the wire has disappeared. But here, these buildings are part of the story, part of the tale, and part of the history of this landscape of the Great War in villages like Mailly-Maillet. So we'll walk past the White House and down this street. Again, many of the buildings here were present during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, and one or two of these I've actually been underneath them into the cellars of some of these houses where there is British graffiti scratched on the walls. Now those we can't visit, but what we can find in this village are the names of British soldiers on several of the buildings that are publicly accessible. And one of those we're walking up towards now, which is the very ornate and very large church here in the village of Mailly-Maillet. It's got a very ornate 16th century facade that was sandbagged up, and they had kind of matting placed in front of it at different periods in the war to protect the ornate facade from bombardments. The top of the church was blown off eventually by 1918, but what we're looking at here, the front face of the church, is very much the original. And what we find on buildings like this is that at some point British soldiers go up to them with a jackknife or whatever it is, a tip of a bayonet, and they scratch their details on there. And often when something like this is sandbagged up or protected, where they leave their name are bits where that protection has kind of peeled back, has been damaged, and there's a little bit of stone on show, and the soldiers go up and they scratch their details on there. And again, when I was walking the routes for walking the Somme all those years ago, and it's 30 years ago this year that I went out and walked the battlefields and prepared the routes that became part of that book, I came across on buildings like this the names of soldiers, and on here I recorded quite a few, including Pioneer Dick Hutt of the Royal Engineers, Private Thomas Musgrove, Private George Steer and Private Percy Blackledge, all of the Army Service Corps. Now, none of those are what you describe as such as frontline units. They're not infantry. They're support units. And they are almost certainly from 1916-17, during that winter, when this was a little bit further back from the front, bit safer for soldiers to wander around in the streets, less German artillery activity in the village, and probably less officers or military foot police to stop them from defacing a building by scratching their details on there. And the 3 Army Service Corps lads on there, Musgrove, Steer and Blackledge, all were part of the Army Service Corps Motor Transport. And in fact, Blackledge's name states ASC MT 1914-16. And they were part of a divisional supply unit or a general supply unit as part of the lines of communication, a motorised unit with lorries bringing supplies from the rear echelon up to the supply points, of which Mailly-Maillet would have been one during that period, where they unload that gear for it to be taken towards the fighting units in the front line area. So it's not untypical to see men who are doing those kind of duties, which gives them a degree of free time to go off and graffiti buildings like this. There's also the graffiti of a soldier in an infantry unit here, a man from the 5th 6th Royal Scots. They were part of the 32nd Division. They amalgamated 2 Royal Scots territorial battalions, the 5th and the 6th battalions, to create the 5th 6th Royal Scots, and they served on the Western Front from 1916 until the end of the war, and according to their war diary were billeted in Mailly-Maillet in late 1916, which again kind of coincides as to when this kind of adding graffiti would have been possible for soldiers like him. And I think these names on these buildings, whether churches or municipal buildings or farmhouses or whatever it is, there's a huge number of them in these villages behind the lines. They're a really important part of that layer of landscape of the Great War, because these are kind of almost like the ghostly names of soldiers who were once here. They connect us to these men. They connect us to those events more than a century ago, and they're incredibly important. And it's a shame that, as yet, no one has kind of catalogued them all. And even in my time, I've seen walls that were particularly heavily graffitied, sadly destroyed, knocked down, or boarded over with something else, and the graffiti has been lost. Thankfully, not here. And if you go to Mailly-Maillet and go to the church, you'll see those lads' names on there. The road off to our left, just past the church, would take us eventually to Auchenvilliers, Ocean Villas. We're not going down there to start off with. We're going to continue to the southern part of the village now, with the park of Mailly-Maillet on the right-hand side. That was part of the extension of the main chateau area. There were some nicely planted trees in there, and there still is today. And we can either walk through that to go to where we're going, or continue down the road, which is what we're going to do in the direction of the next village, Engel-Belmere, which we've discussed in a previous podcast. And that brings us to the outskirts of the village, where the road becomes slightly sunken, with a high wall and a gateway on the corner of the road junction on our right. And on the other side, that building was a convent, a pre-war convent, used by the military during the Great War, with the nuns evacuated. And it was here in early 1916, in this road where we're standing now, that Lieutenant Colonel Frank Percy Crozier made his men of the 9th Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles, part of the 36th Ulster Division, who had been on the front line since the previous autumn and had seen frontline service just down the road at Ocean Villas and Red Ann Ridge. He made them line up here to hear the execution of one of their comrades, of one of the men from that battalion. And that was the execution of Private James Crozier, which took place here on the 27th of February 1916, so before the Battle of the Somme. Crozier, James Crozier, was an underage soldier, a teenage Tommy, and Colonel Crozier had promised the lad's mother that he would look after him when the battalion went to France. He would eventually be the one that secured his fate, his execution here in early 1916. Colonel Crozier became Brigadier General Crozier by the end of the war, was an interesting individual, to put it politely, and a man that I often am amazed survived the war, considering the things that he did. He wrote a book later, for example, called The Men I Killed, which gives you a bit of a insight into his character. Jimmy Crozier, the young lad from the 9th Royal Irish Rifles, had been unable to cope with his service in the front line, the experiences that he had here on the Western Front, and he deserted, and at his trial it was recommended that he should face the ultimate sanction, which was the death penalty. That was confirmed by a field general court-martial. The sentence was death, and sadly, as the phraseology of the documents of the period say, that sentence was duly carried out here. Now, we've discussed men who were shot at dawn in a previous podcast episode. You can go back to that episode to hear more about that. But this is one of those locations where we can tie that, layer this place to that aspect of Great War history. And I often wonder what those lads in this battalion standing here in this lane, unable to see the execution but hear it, what they must have thought of this. It really is quite incredible. We'll return to the subject of James Crozier later on in this walk when we visit his grave. But we're going to take this side road where the gates are now and walk down a straight road towards the wooded area on this part of Mailly village. And as we come down here where the wall of the convent ends, there's a big domed chapel, the Chapelle Madame. And this was almost certainly the chapel, the religious chapel for the convent that was here before the war. It's an original building, a very impressive building that was restored about a dozen or so years ago, and one that Edmund Blunden mentions in Undertones of War. And I'll just read for you now what he said in that account. In a garden of solitude of this little town, there rose a small domed building, as yet but a trifle disfigured, with plaster and glass shaken down to the mosaic floor, in the middle of which stood the marble tomb of a great lady, a princess, if I do not forget, of a better century. There the pigeons fluttered and alighted, and the light through the high pale tinted panes seemed to rest with inviolable grace on holy ground. So this was the Chapelle Madame, and the Madame was the lady that Blunden refers to, buried in the tomb there. I've just recorded a video about this building for the Old Frontline YouTube channel, and I'll embed that in the podcast page for this episode so you can have a look at it. Because, again, like the church, when we walk up to this building and we see it made of this Picardy chalk, we find very quickly that the names of soldiers are on here. And again, this was something that I discovered when I was walking the Somme and spent a lot of time in this village, and uncovered buildings like this, often through talking to locals. This one is particularly numerous in terms of the amount of graffiti that's on there, and one of the commonalities that you see in buildings like this as to where the graffiti is, it's very often in doorways where soldiers can kind of tuck themselves in the doorway, hidden from the military foot police, hidden from officers or NCOs who might tell them off for scratching their name, and they get in there and they add their names to the side of the actual entranceway to the building or the side of that doorway. And you'll certainly see that here. One of the very large engraved names at the top is a soldier from the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment who was from Pittsmoor in Sheffield, and that's written very prominently. There's some other names of lads from Sussex at the bottom who could well be from Edmund Blunden's battalion or one of the South Downs battalions that were here in the summer of 1916. So again, an incredible time capsule of the Great War, a much older building which encompasses part of the soldiers' experience, what they saw when they came here, but also covered in graffiti and names of men who passed through this part of the old front line more than a century ago. Very, for me anyway, a very evocative kind of structure to come to reach out and touch those names and touch that past. From here we'll return to the area close to the church and that main road junction. We're going to turn off there, and we're walking down now along a road where there are some older buildings that were there during the Great War. You can see that by the design of many of the buildings, but the further we go along here, we're coming to the part of the village that was nearer and nearer to the battlefield, and so therefore nearer and nearer to German shell fire. So on this kind of southeastern and eastern side of Mailly-Maillet, a lot of the buildings were completely destroyed by 1918, and there's a lot more modern buildings or 1920s rebuilds from after the war in this sector of the village. And so it's from here that we'll continue to the other side of Mailly-Maillet and then finish our walk by moving closer to the battlefield area, connecting us to the fighting of both 1916 and 1918. Coming out through this eastern side of Mailly-Maillet village, it brings us back into the main street, and we come across the local war memorial for the men of Mailly-Maillet who were killed in the Great War. It's kind of a column close to an area where the village pond had been before the Great War. And looking down this bit of the street at the buildings that were here, again we see quite a lot of shrapnel damage to the buildings that are in this part of the street. There used to be some great little cafes along here, which always kind of reminded me of the kind of cafes that were in villages behind the lines. When the British were here in 1916, the civilian population of Mailly had been moved out, so there was no estaminets open to the troops here. They had to go a couple of villages back to get to those, but still they were kind of very evocative of that type of place. They've all sadly long gone. There are very few Somme villages today that have any kind of cafe in them. And from here we're going to cross over this main road and head out into an area of long kind of valleys on the northern side of Mailly-Maillet towards the next village of Collincamps. And in these valleys here, the field artillery had a lot of their gun positions. So the units that were in the line facing the Redan Ridge or Beaumont-Hamel or Serre often would have had artillery here. The Royal Garrison artillery may have had some heavier guns in this area as well, and that is kind of reflected in the burials that you see in some of the cemeteries in this area. And talking of that, it brings us out to the civilian cemetery on this far side of Mailly village. It's a civil cemetery that goes back to before the Great War. There was quite a large French plot here when the British arrived in 1915, and then it became a place of burial for British soldiers. So this was originally the main burial site for British soldiers who died in and around Mailly-Maillet in that 1915-16 period. Started, as we've said, by French soldiers. They would have buried their dead from the fighting around Serre-Hebuterne and from the frontline positions in that sector that became their front line after the battle there of June 1915. And then when the British took over, this was an obvious place to continue to bury the dead, and British and Commonwealth soldiers were buried here later. The first British units were in this sector in 1915, and although there were some smaller cemeteries in the village, this does seem to have been the kind of main area, and burials continued here despite the opening of Mailly Wood Cemetery until December of 1916, and then it was used again in March to July of 1918. There's 122 British burials here, 3 New Zealand and 1 Newfoundland. Early graves, the earlier burials in here, are men from the 51st Highland Division and the 36th Ulster Division who were occupying the front lines on this part of the sector, particularly the Ulster Division, who were up in the forward trenches in the Redan Ridge sector not long after they first came to France. And there's quite a few that kind of stood out to me anyway, men from the Barnsley Pals buried in here from my time of living up in Elsica. I came across some of the very early Pals who had enlisted in Barnsley in 1914 and then came across from the Suez Canal where they'd served in 1915 and then here to the Western Front. Some of their early casualties are buried in this cemetery, and they're all Barnsley and district lads. When we look at some of the support units that are buried amongst the infantry soldiers in here, we find a few engineers. One of them is a tunneler. Sapper George William Osborne served in the 252nd Tunnelling Royal Engineers. He was a Leicester lad who was killed on the 25th of January 1916, so nearly 6 months before the Battle of the Somme began. And he was killed when the Germans blew a camouflage mine underneath the Red Hand Ridge when his tunnelling company was operating there. So the Red Hand Ridge initially in this sector was the main area of mine warfare of the war underground, where the French and the Germans had fought each other in that way, and when the British arrived they did the same. And 252 Tunnelling Company were very heavily involved in that. They'd taken over the French galleries and built their own and taken on the fight to the Germans, but the Germans had got the upper hand on this particular moment and blew one of these camouflages, which was a mine with a charge that went sideways to cave in British or Allied tunnels rather than produce a crater up on the surface. And this camouflage caused some casualties, including his death, and he may well have been their first casualty underground in the 252 Tunnelling Company. Now, they were doing fairly small mining activities at this stage, but they would go on to be the tunnelling unit that constructed the Hawthorne mine that was blown underneath the Hawthorne Ridge on the 1st of July 1916, captured on Mallin's films and in Lieutenant Brooks' photograph to become that kind of iconic mine explosion of the Great War. So they were billeted in and around Mailly-Maillet at that time. The Newfoundlander that's buried here is Lieutenant Owen Steele, who was mortally wounded by shell fire when the regiment was in billets, having come out of the trenches after the debacle of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and they were in the village of Collincamps. He died on the 8th of July 1916, aged 29, so a week after the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Born at St John's in Newfoundland, he was educated in there and won the Newfoundland walking competition before the war, and he worked in the family business and was one of the first to enlist with his brother James, who also served in the same battalion, and then he was subsequently commissioned in 1915. His letters and journals survive. They were published in a book about his life and war service, and I'll put details of that onto the podcast website. And you can follow his story from enlistment through to his service at Suvla Bay at Gallipoli, at Caribou Hill, where the Newfoundland Regiment was in 1915, through to the Battle of the Somme. And his grave now overlooks Mailly-Maillet, and he'd been a billeting officer here for the Newfoundland Regiment on a number of occasions. A billeting officer's job, it was an appointment rather than a rank. Officers would often take turns doing it, where they'd come into a village like this and they'd ascertain what buildings were available, how many men could be placed in each building. They'd often chalk mark that up on the front of the building and then make sure everyone was put in the appropriate buildings and everyone was safe, out of the way, not visible, and inside one of these buildings before they moved up to the front line area. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the Newfoundland Regiment, of course, is famous for their attack at Beaumont-Hamel in that area that is now the Newfoundland Park. He was in what was called the 10%. They were the men selected to be left out of battle, not to go into the attack, something that I'm sure that he wished he wasn't a part of, and he had to watch his brother go up to the line to an uncertain future. The unit went over the top, as we know from previous podcasts, suffered terrible casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, his brother James being amongst the wounded, but he missed that, he wasn't part of it, and he saw the shattered survivors, the handful of shattered survivors, come back. A week later, as the battalion is looking at its future, working out how it's going to rebuild after these crippling losses, safe, in inverted commas, away from the battle area in a billet, they come under shell fire and he gets wounded in the leg by a large shell fragment, is admitted to an advanced dressing station in Mailly-Maillet where they have to amputate his leg, infection sets in and he dies of complications the same day, a week after the Battle of the Somme, in what was supposedly a safe billet behind the lines, one of the many cruel ironies of the First World War. It's an interesting story with Owen Steele, and I'm so glad that his letters are widely available now, because it was a kind of a little grave that many people came to but didn't really know that much about, and now we've got a kind of a fuller picture of his life through that book. This is a cemetery for me that, when I've gone back in the last few years, has a particular resonance, because I stood in this cemetery on the 28th of February 2020. That was the last day that I spent on the Somme before the COVID epidemic. A few weeks later, the epidemic was in full swing. We were all at home and the Old Frontline podcast began. And I stood here on a very snowy, cold morning on the Somme, a typical winter's morning on the Somme, and looked out across the landscape. As I always do when it's my last day on the Somme, I wonder when I'm going to return and what's going to happen before I get back here again. I couldn't have possibly imagined what would unfold over the course of the next months, and couldn't possibly have believed that I wouldn't get back here again until September 2021, well over a year and a half later. Well, I got to Flanders during the COVID epidemic when that was possible. Travelling into France, coming down to the Somme was much more difficult. And my beloved Somme Battlefields that had been so much a part of my life for so many years was denied to me for such a long time. And I think, not that I've ever really taken it for granted, it certainly made me realise that we can never take these things, so much of our lives, we can never take it for granted. And the importance of these places, I think, for all of us, was highlighted during that period. So a place where I once stood in the cold and the snow of the Somme on the eve of the whole world changing kind of puts so much into perspective, I think. From here, we'll walk back down into the village of Mailly-Maillet, back down to the main road. In this case, we're going to turn left at the main junction and head out of the village towards Serre, and eventually this road goes all the way to Arras. It's a road that's been a conduit to war over many, many centuries. Roman legionnaires once marched down here, Napoleon's troops, soldiers in the Great War, German tanks in 1940, and Allied British tanks liberating the area in September 1944. It's certainly one of those criss-cross paths of history that we often talk about on this podcast. And it's a road that takes us out the last few buildings in Mailly-Maillet village, including some of the last original ones. Again, there used to be a little bed and breakfast on the left-hand side. I'm not even sure if it's still there. And they had names of soldiers engraved into the wooden beams of their house there, which was quite an interesting thing to see when you stayed there as one of their B&B guests. But coming out of the village, as we get out to the fields that begin to head off to our left and right as the main road continues, there's a mound, a tree and bush-covered mound on the left-hand side, which many people just sail past and don't even realise is there. That is the ruins of Mailly-Maillet Windmill. Now, I think it was a ruin even in 1914. I've never seen a photograph of it as a complete structure, which makes me think that it was just a ruin. But it was a ruin that sat on a high point, because windmills are always built on high points, and it afforded a view across this ground towards the front line. And from here, even today, you can see the copses up at Serre, for example. You can see the crest of the Red Ann Ridge just beyond Serre Road No. 2 Cemetery. And if you look to your right, you will see the trees of the Hawthorne Crater. So they will be the kind of landmarks, and you can see much more beyond those. But in terms of the landscape here during the war, observers within this ruinous windmill had a great view of the frontline area. And I've read that the Royal Engineers came in and they built a concrete structure within the windmill to create an observation post for observers, possibly from men from survey units of the Royal Engineers who were mapping the front at that time, and then almost certainly it would have been used by Royal Artillery, Royal Field and Royal Garrison Artillery forward observation officers as an observation post to spot for the guns to protect the infantry up in the front line area. I've never seen it uncovered. I think that it's still here, possibly because there is that concrete structure in the middle and it would be very difficult to move. And I've never even seen a photograph of it at the end of the war. So if you have any images of what Mailly Windmill once looked like, I'd love to hear from you. It's one of those kind of little forgotten parts of the Somme, but tucked away in the archive somewhere, I'm sure there's a drawing or there's a war diary of an engineer unit that built it. It's not in Peter Oldham's book on bunkers in the First World War, as far as I know, but it's certainly an interesting and important part of the infrastructure in this battlefield area. And we can see why it was so important when we stand here, and we can see what was visible from it today, just as it would have been 100 years ago, more than a century ago, in 1915-16. We're going to continue along the road, and it is a busy road. It's not the best road to walk along. You can walk along the sides of the path, and ahead of us we can see a large farm complex on a junction, and then a track going off to our left towards a visible military cemetery with a long tree-lined avenue behind it. As we come down the gravel track to the cemetery itself, which is on the left-hand side, the tree-lined avenue is just ahead of us. For me, this is a very atmospheric location. It's typical of the Somme roads, tree-lined, and typical of that landscape of 1916. When you read the accounts of soldiers, they talk about marching down these tree-lined avenues. And this is one that was here in 1916, just as we see it today. It came from the village of Collincamp up past this area of the sucrery, which was a sugar factory where sugar beet was brought in to be turned into sugar. The ruins of that sucrery had been destroyed in 1914-15, and it was now a ruinous structure just by the side of this track. And coming from their billets in Collincamps, units would march down this track and then entered the communication trenches, which would have been just across to our right from where we are, and then moved up to the front line at Serre. So many of those POWs battalions, the Barnsley POWs, the Bradford POWs, the Accrington POWs, the Sheffield City Battalion, the Leeds POWs, the Hull lads, they marched down here on the eve of the Battle of the Somme to move up to that forward area, to that catastrophic battle that killed so many of those northern POWs on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The cemetery today is called the Sucrery Cemetery, after the sucrery, the sugar factory that was once here. Like many of the cemeteries in this wider area of this part of the Somme battlefields, it was started by the French, and there were French burials here. It was then used by British units when they took over this sector in July of 1915. They were mainly units from the 4th Division, a regular division that had been up in the Ypres salient, fighting in the Second Battle of Ypres during the first use of poison gas in April and May of 1915, and then it moved down here for a rest to take over from the French. And initially this cemetery was actually known as the 10th Brigade Cemetery, which was one of the brigades in that division. That name was subsequently changed to Sucrery Cemetery. It remained in use by a lot of different units, particularly the POWs in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme and then during that early stage of the Battle of the Somme, but it remained in use until March of 1917, and then it was used again in March and April of 1918 when the New Zealand Division front line was very close to where we're standing, when, as we discussed, they held the line here alongside the Australians to the north and the British to the south in the 12th Eastern Division. So it very much connects us to that wider period of the Somme fighting. And if we look at the summer of 1918, when the counter-offensive went in and the Germans were pushed back, this was an area where American troops served. American units that were detached from the main AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, fought alongside British units that were here, and they were part of the advance in this sector. I suspect American troops perhaps were once buried in this area and may well have been once buried in this cemetery, although I found no particular record of that. The 285 French burials and 12 German graves that were once here were removed after the war. Again, all of the sites that we've spoken about where there were once French burials, they were all removed and taken to cemeteries in the wider area or repatriated home. Just down the road from here towards Serre is the Serre-Hebuterne French Cemetery, which has got many of the dead from 1914-15 in it, and some of those may well have once been buried here at the Sucrery Cemetery. Possibly it was the French who originally even gave it that name. I've never seen the French details of the burials here or what they called it. Rifleman James Crozier is buried just to your left as you come in. He's in that row close to the main cemetery wall. For a long, long time, it was my impression that he'd been buried in Mailly-Maillet and his grave was moved here after the war. But again, looking at the War Graves Commission records that are on the website, and if we look at Crozier's page, there's no indication that he was concentrated here after the war was over. So this looks to be his original burial ground. So when he was shot in Mailly-Maillet, he was moved to this cemetery for burial, which is interesting in its own right. Why wasn't he buried in the village itself. I think this is all part of our evolving understanding of the subject of the Great War, and indeed this landscape of the Great War, which continues to give up its secrets in all kinds of different ways. When we look at the kind of main area of the cemetery, we find a lot of 1st of July casualties in here. The POWs battalions that were marching down the tree-lined avenue saw men from the Medical Corps digging trenches in here and called out to them and asked them what that was about, and the reply came back that they were preparing mass graves for the expected casualties. And sadly, so many men who marched up this way on the eve of the battle may well have been filling those graves within just a few short hours. But amongst the 1st of July casualties in here are 2 battalion commanders. Lieutenant Colonel the Honourable Lawrence Charles Walter Pork of the 1st Battalion Hampshire Regiment, who was killed aged 45 leading his men into action, and Lieutenant Colonel John Audley Thickness of the 1st Somerset Light Infantry, who was killed at the Quadrilateral aged 46 on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. His adjutant, Captain C.C. Ford, is also buried close by. The 1st Somersets and the 1st Hampshires took a hell of a pasting in the battle for the Quadrilateral. The Heidenkopf, as the Germans called it, the heathen's head, when they attacked into that position, and almost all of the senior officers became casualties. These 2 men killed in action, others wounded, and it led to the Brigadier General Prowse, Bertie Prowse, who had once commanded the 1st Somersets, go up and try and take command of the situation himself. He was mortally wounded and died of wounds on the night of the 1st of July. So the kind of command structure of the units that attacked in that area on the first day of the Battle of the Somme suffered absolutely catastrophic casualties, from platoon commanders to company commanders to battalion commanders to the brigade commander as well. And again is another example how not every general dies in bed. When I was here last autumn, I came here on a trip that I did to go and make some videos about the old front line for the YouTube channel. And I particularly like coming to this cemetery, particularly in the autumn light when the sun is low and the shadows are long. And it was a particularly beautiful morning when we came here in October last year. And I went to the grave of both Pork and Thickness and some of the others who I've researched in this cemetery. And sometimes, even if you've been to a cemetery many, many times, you find that graves almost call out to you. You suddenly see something that you hadn't seen before. And I do believe that it is like a voice from the past wanting you to discover more about that person. And in here, on that day, it was the grave of Arthur Stanley Clutterbuck that stood out. It was the badge of the Worcestershire Regiment and then the inscription below that caught my eye. And it was an inscription that reads, "He was a man, take him for all in all, we shall never look upon his like again." And that really kind of resonated with me. This generation of men who'd served in the Great War, they weren't unique. Another generation just a few years later would fight in an even greater war in many respects. But there is something about these men, something about not just their innocence, but who they were as people, what their values were, what they stood for. And I think that sometimes we connect to that through the inscriptions that we find on headstones like Arthur Stanley Clutterbuck's. He was here with a territorial battalion, the 1st 8th Worcestershire Regiment, and his brother Norman was serving as an officer in the same battalion. Their father was a local councillor in Birmingham. And when Arthur was killed by a shell, aged only 19 on the 14th of July 1916, his brother Norman attended the burial service here. He'd stood at this grave just as I stood at it last October. And again, there's a kind of resonance with the past here. But he wouldn't survive the Great War. He would go on to be killed with that battalion, the 1st 8th Worcesters, on the Hindenburg line the following April, in April 1917. And I guess when we find these connections, I mean, I wasn't looking for this young officer. I wasn't looking for that inscription. It kind of found me. And I think that is the power of places like this. Silent cities, as Kipling called them, but never silent. Here there are stories that resonate down the century, almost wanting to be told. The past reaching out for us, enabling new light to be cast across that old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.